Our next speaker is Wayne House, not H. Wayne House, but Wayne House. And I've known him for a lot of years. In fact, this is a guy that converted me to Max. And I've been grateful to him ever since. And we were once Ice House, but that's a whole nother story. And Wayne is a theologian, and he also has a law degree. And one of his professors was Anita Hill. But his study partner was Michelle Bachman. So maybe you could tell us some stories here. The Lord has forgiven you. And he is going to present a paper that Dr. LaHaye specifically requested on why apostasia, well, I believe very likely, Dr. LaHaye would say absolutely, and I think Wayne says probably, refers to the rapture or the physical disappearance of believers in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So come up here and do that.
And some would say definitely not. So we have all gradations on how this is understood. And you have to be careful when you're doing work like this that you don't overstate your case. And sometimes when you present views, you present them for the purpose of having people to interact with them so that you can rethink them. The Pre-Trib Rapture doesn't depend upon this translation today. But nonetheless, if it is true, then it certainly adds some impetus to the viewpoint. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. Sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. We have some physical sickness in our family and just was not able to make it yesterday. But I flew in this morning, or last night. What was it? 11:40 last night from Portland. Well, is the rapture found in 2 Thessalonians 2:3? The letters of Paul to the Thessalonian church were written early in his ministry to the new believers of Macedonia. These Christians eagerly accepted the teaching that Paul gave to them in the short time he was with them, but no sooner had Paul left than persons came into their midst who perverted the apostles' teaching. In regard to the coming of Christ for Christians, Paul apparently taught that they should be diligent in looking for Christ to come. 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5. Unfortunately, however, someone argued that Jesus had already returned. Must have been a preterist. This puzzled the believers due to the fact that they had not been taken in the rapture, 1 Thessalonians 4:13. Now, Paul wanted to provide additional evidence to assure them that Jesus had not returned and proof that this was so. This gives rise then to this passage that we're going to look at. Now, I'm not going to talk about the whole passage of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. In another work, I went into more detail on some of these matters because I think that you find in every single chapter of 1 Thessalonians a different word used for the coming of Christ, all meaning the same thing. And when you come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, you are assuming knowledge of 1 Thessalonians on the part of the readers. So I think that has to be brought to bear. But then you have this term called apostasia that we're going to spend some time talking about, in which there is certainly considerable difference of opinion, with a majority view, certainly not mine. But that's okay, I've been in the minority before. You can't vote in truth. Now, how have biblical scholars understood apostasia? That's the word apostasia, from which we get our word apostasy as a transliteration not a translation, which is part of the problem, as you will see. They've understood this word, translated falling away in the KJV, in 4 different ways. How one understands this Greek word may impact how one sees the return of Jesus. So let us examine the different interpretations below. Now, one view is that apostasy refers to the man of sin. This interpretation says that the word apostasy refers to the man of sin in verse 3, what scholars call apposition. That is apostasy, that is to say the man of sin. Rather than it being 2 things, it's one thing. The church father Augustine said, quote, "No one can doubt that he," that is Paul, "wrote this of Antichrist and of the day of judgment, which he here calls the day of the Lord, nor that he declared that this day should not come first unless he first came, who is called the apostate." Apostate, to wit, from the Lord God. So he sees apostasy as referring essentially to the apostate. That's one view, not held by anyone much today. Apostasy referring to the falling away from the faith. Second view is that which is adopted by the KJV of the Bible, namely falling away. Under this view, apostasy, or the word apostasia, speaks of a falling away or defection from the faith. When this occurs, the Antichrist, the man of sin, will arise showing signs and wonders. This view seems to originate with the translation of the King James Version in 1611, but it is popular today. I'm not saying no one held to a view of the idea of the concept of apostasy in 2 Thessalonians, but this translation, to my knowledge, is unique. In other words, it starts here. And certainly this became to be adopted as the idea of religious apostasy and defection. However, there is not a consistency regarding who will actually fall away. Does it refer to the church, to the Jews during the tribulation, to non-Christians? Who is it who's falling away? And that's to be left for somebody else to talk about sometime. Let us look at some examples of those who hold to each view. Theologian Charles Ryrie believes that the apostasy in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 speaks of a future falling away of those within the professing church who never truly believed in Jesus, and believes that this view is found in Revelation 17 and 2 Timothy 3:1. And again, I'm not going to go into any depth on these things. I'm just presenting the basic views. 2, Jews during the tribulation. The second interpretation asserts that Jews who reject God during the tribulation are in view in this passage. Martin Rosenthal has argued that even as the word is used in the New Testament when Paul was opposed by Jews, so this will be how Jews will act during the tribulation. He says that they will, quote, totally abandon the God of their fathers and their messianic hope in favor of a false religion, humanism, and a false Messiah, the Antichrist, 2 Thessalonians 2:2-12, end quote. A third view is that it refers to non-Christians. Some have also viewed the falling away as referring to non-Christians as a whole. Hogg and Vine, as well as Schaeffer, believe the term referred to the way in which unsaved humanity failed to embrace the truth of God found in the gospel after the church has been removed from the earth. So your 3 views. Now, in reference to the meaning of the term again, some view apostasia referring to a revolt or rebellion against God. And of course, that the word apostasy is at times, particularly in the Septuagint, used in that way. Understanding apostasy as revolt or rebellion stands in strong contrast to the former falling away. The latter implies a defection from the faith or from God, while the former speaks of a forceful or violent rejection of God. Quite different, their emphasis. A.L. Moore explains the view, quote, the rebellion comes first. Here Paul uses imagery drawn probably from Daniel 11:36. Rebellion, apostasia, could refer to political apostasy or to military revolt in classical Greek, but in the Septuagint, the LXX, it denotes religious rebellion against God. The thought is, we suggest, that when the moment comes for Christ to appear in glory and for all that rebels against God to be unmasked and cast out, the forces of evil will arise as never before in a last desperate effort against God. Rather than a defection from the faith or failure to embrace the gospel, the majority of scholars probably hold to this option, believing the word expresses deliberate opposition against God and or his people, and even may be a revolt against public order or government. This disorder would set the stage for the rise of a person who would bring back order known as the Antichrist. So you basically have a breakdown of society, and this paves the way for the Antichrist. Well, now to the more correct view. I say that for Tommy. I'm more reticent. The final view is certainly held by a minority today, but that apostasy may refer to the departure of the church has been embraced by a number of scholars, including E. Schuessler English, Stanley Ellison, Gordon Lewis, Kenneth Wiest, Tim LaHaye, Tommy Ice. Since the view is rarely considered by an option by commentators, I mean, just pick up your commentaries on 1st or on 2nd Thessalonians, and you won't see this probably argued. It becomes incumbent upon those who hold such a view to make a vigorous defense. Whether or not apostasia may mean rapture does not rely only upon the meaning of the term in Greek, but whether the idea of defection or revolt in the end times is found as an event in Paul's teaching, as well as the likely meaning of the word in the immediate context of the letter to the Thessalonians. Let me back up a moment. I hope you see the significance of that statement. When I start doing the word studies on the word apostasia and its cognates, in the classical period, you know, the secular Greek of the time, New Testament, Septuagint, patristic, and such like, I have to admit that it's pretty sparse to argue the word departure in the sense of rapture. It's really sparse, which doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's sparse. Now, I could do some other word studies for you, by the way, that does the same thing, in which the correct meaning is not necessarily the majority meaning within the use of a word, because you have specialized communities that use words differently than the general public. For example, for such a long time, Christians are the ones who said sharing. You ever notice I'm sharing? Now I'm beginning to hear it the general public. I want to share something. You know, it bleeds over, and it may be that it bled over even after the time of the New Testament from a more unique usage. But when you read the idea of revolt and rebellion in Paul, do you really find the emphasis on this idea that's argued by apostasia in 2 Thessalonians, if this in fact means revolt or rebellion? In Paul, do you really find that? And secondly, do you find that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2? Now, if in fact 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, or Paul's broader context of argument, does not really emphasize or give much indication of this idea, then one wonder why Paul at this point would introduce a word which is foreign to his argument. See, it works both ways. He would be introducing a word which doesn't fit into his argument, which would be very obscure to the people reading it. On the other hand, this is, in fact, I think, a better argument for the idea of the term apostasia meaning departure of some sort, because that is, in fact, the argument of Paul in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But continuing. Regarding this first consideration, the nature of the idea of defection revolt in Paul's teaching, Ellison captured the likely scenario. This is Stanley Ellison. At the risk of being out of step with most commentaries on the subject, may we suggest the greater acceptability of an alternative view. The evidence for a great singular defection from the faith occurring just prior to the rapture or to the day of the Lord is really based on questionable ground. And the first reference generally appealed to, 1 Timothy 4, Paul does speak of an apostasy from the faith, but not as a unique end-time event. See, Paul was speaking very much about people to whom he had given teaching, that false teachers like he had been experiencing in his life day to day would come and finally have a field day because he's gone. Remember what he had to do? Go to church, teach. He goes on to the next church. What happens? Right after him, somebody's teaching the opposite. Has to write a letter back. He was always fighting this problem. I suspect he's thinking, right after I'm off the scene, these guys are going to have a heyday. Is he really talking about the end time tribulation and such like, or time of the end? This he characterized as erroneous doctrine, hypocritical living, and improper legalism. In using the term here, he qualified it with the phrase, from the faith, which is going to be important to our argument in a moment. The idea of a defection from the faith. By itself, it meant simply departure. That's what the word means. Departure from what is a debate, but it means departure. In the second reference to defection, 2 Timothy 3:1 following, Paul does not use the term apostasy, but merely speaks of evil men in general in the latter times. His point here is that evil men will become more and more depraved as the age wears on. 2 Timothy 3:13. Thus, this passage has no real relation to apostasy from the faith, and certain does not warn of some specific final defection that will precede the rapture or introduce the day of the Lord. There's a paucity of evidence in Pauline literature for this idea. You may want to try to argue it somewhere else, but we're talking about Paul's letters and his terms. The remainder of the chapter will be given to the meaning of the technical term apostasy and what best meaning fits its usage in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Well, how has apostasy been translated? Jerome translated the Greek New Testament into Latin in the 4th century, the Vulgate. By the way, did a pretty good job. He really did. He used the Latin word descensio, meaning departure. By the way, he had the word apostasia in the vocabulary of the Latin Church. And we're talking about 4th century. Lots of examples of this. The word apostasia became a coined word, transliterated just like the word baptism is. Transliterated, and people use it. He had the word. He didn't use it. If he had meant it, he should have used it. Instead, he used the word departure. Now, one of my detractors on this, who I actually have not covered in this paper for different reasons, makes a point that my reference to Jerome here doesn't help because the other example of the word apostasy in the New Testament used by Jerome is also descensio. And so it certainly doesn't mean rapture. But that's not my argument. My argument is that it means departure. Departure from what is a contextual question. So I grant when he says departure from the faith of Moses, it means apostasy in the sense of defection from the faith. And Jerome rightly translates it descensio, departure. So that's no argument against my argument. In fact, supports it. Jerome was literal in his translation. What the departure is from is really a matter of context. Well, moving on. This meaning was continued in the earliest English translations, such as Wycliffe and Tyndale, Cloverdale, Cranmer, Breeches, and so forth and so on. The Geneva Bible, so important. The King James Version deviated from this translation. The first, translating apostasy as falling away. Now, I didn't have a chart here for you, but if you looked at the chart that I actually had in another product I did, every one of these says departure, 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 departure. Every one of them followed Jerome's descensio, departure. Now, we can debate departure from what, but the question is departure. That's the meaning of the word. And I don't know why they're afraid to translate it that way. For fear they lose an argument, because obviously they have the word apostasy. They say, see, it means apostasy. But if you just say departure, then we have to debate departure from what? Well, Jerome, he translated it correctly, departure, and all the English translations followed Jerome until the KJV. I hope this doesn't hurt any people that are, let me move on. The King James Version deviated from the translation. Now, no explanation was given for doing this. Moreover, Theodore Beza transliterated apostasia as apostasy rather than translating it, which anytime you do that, bringing and making an English word and then filling it full with theological meaning is always a problem. I prefer just give me the translation and let me decide the meaning. Okay? The minute you say apostasy, then you've already decided it once you transliterate it, because it has a history. And that's, in fact, what happened in the early church, in the first several centuries of the church, although Jerome didn't follow that, fortunately. Well, arguments that favor apostasy as a rapture. Let's move on down and see what that is. The sense of departure in classical and biblical sources. The word apostasy is regularly translated rebellion or defection in Greek literature before the time of the writing of the New Testament. In a few cases, however, it does have the sense of departure. Now, I'm giving you what the lexicographers say. Do you realize these people are human beings, and they do, as they seek to understand a word, put a meaning to it? And then we have to examine their usage. And I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, you have to do this in some respect. I mean, you say departure from the faith, you could call that defection. It's not particularly wrong, but we have to be careful we understand the basic idea. The reason for this difference is the context of the passages. At times, the word does not occur in a context in which the matter of rebellion against authority or defection from a person, ideology, or religious faith is in view. Rather, the noun adheres more closely to the verbal meaning of depart or some other spatial sense. One criticism that I've received is that, well, verbs may mean departure, and they do repeatedly. Many examples of the verbal form from which this noun form derives, and verbs essentially give rise to nouns in language. The nouns develop a meaning that's a little different, but you say, well, the verbs mean one thing, the nouns don't have to mean exactly the same thing. And that is true, but sometimes it also does mean the same thing. So it's not the question of whether it ever does, it's the question, is it necessary to? And that is decided by contextual reading. Rather, the noun adheres more closely to the verbal meaning of depart or some other spatial sense. The predominant meaning of rebellion and at times defection is also found in the Greek Old Testament. There are several examples. One must be careful when deviating from the established meanings in classical and biblical writings, yet one must also not be afraid to take the minority meaning with spatial connotation when context warrants. Such may be the case in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Now, I wanted just to give you something that's not in your reading right there. How am I doing on time? Good? Something from a lengthy article I wrote on this question that Tommy and Tim Demme, I believe, both did this, right? Is that you two guys did when the trumpet does something? Okay. This lengthy chapter, I have a section called The Indeterminacy of the Meaning of Apostasia. There can be little question the noun apostasia has been translated generally as carrying a non-spatial meaning, usually defection, rebellion, falling away, revolt, and extra-biblical literature. Also in the Septuagint, the noun regularly refers either to revolt against government or so forth. The lexica provide additional proof of these meanings. If one merely counted the times apostasy is used with these meanings or wholly relied on the lexica, then the case would be closed on the rapture view. If you're using a count, it's overwhelming not. However, such an approach would not yield a fully developed understanding of the word. There can be no question that the verb form allows the idea of spatial departure, and it is used that way many times in the Septuagint. In fact, more times than the ideas of defection or revolt combined, if you take the verbal form. It's clearly the idea of departure and usually a spatial idea, and not anything to do with defection or revolt. The response to this is that even if this is true, the noun form does not carry the idea of a spatial departure, but this is not accurate. The noun form allows for apostasy as a simple departure in the classical period, provided by examples from Little and Scott. Their lexicon gives departure and disappearance as secondary meanings. If one says that this is not important because this meaning is only classical or ancient and thus lost its meaning by the time of the New Testament, then I may turn to the same root meaning for apostasy in the patristic era. So you have it in an earlier and later period, as indicated in the definitions for the noun form in Lamp's patristic Greek lexicon. Although the noun used in the sense of a spatial departure is not the normal meaning, though it is true for the verb, during New Testament times, a word is found with this meaning in time periods before and after the New Testament era. It is likely to have been understood this way at least sometimes. It was also understood to have this meaning in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Of course, I mentioned Jerome. The real question is why the noun apostasia, which can mean departure, is so often used for defection or revolt, but is used so few times for departure, unlike the verb. Certainly, I have no final answer. But the idea of departure from the faith of Israel or rebellion against a foreign power became a natural use of the word, and we find it repeatedly in such contexts. But the key is that it does not inherently carry the meaning of defection or revolt. It does so only because of the context in which it's found. You get my point? In other words, there's nothing inherent in the meaning itself. You know, you have a meaning that's a root meaning, a basal meaning, I should say. And from that meaning revolves other meanings that launch from it as they find themselves in different contexts. So you do have that basal meaning of departure from different things, but all of those are defined by context. Just the fact that you have in the Bible a lot of discussion of people in rebellion against God. You ever see that in the Old Testament? There's a lot of discussion in the Old Testament about rebellion against God and defection from the faith. There's a lot of discussion, and thus you find a lot of usages of it. You also have certain instances of that, certainly in other literature. In the New Testament, this idea is only found once. Only one time in the Gospels. In the Acts. And so it doesn't surprise me, but you only have one instance possibly of rapture, but if it is there, then it fits within the context of the discussion. I'm not going to read this next session, but I just want to point out one thing to you. One thing you find interesting in the 2 Thessalonians passage in verse 3 is that you have an unusual use of the term because there's no specific stated context of anything to do with rebellion or defection. And you have the word apostasia with the Greek article, the departure, whatever that is. You find another example of that same thing in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 15, where they used the only other example that I found of the article used with the word apostasia. And in there you have a context, or you would not know what it meant. You have a context there of clearly the idea of a rebellion. So again, I want to emphasize the idea of context to you. Moving on. I was going to say something about that, but I think I'll move on now. Idea of second coming through 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul is deeply concerned with the coming of Christ for believers. This is clear in that in each chapter of 1 Thessalonians, he speaks of Jesus' coming for his people. The apostle in 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 through 10a speaks of the rescue from the coming wrath that God's Son would provide for believers. Paul says the Thessalonians gave him hope and joy at the coming of Christ. That's chapter 2. The pivotal passage you find in 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 17, in which the apostle reveals that the dead would be caught up, from which we get the word rapture, the Latin word raptura, together with living saints to be with Christ. Chapter 5, then he continues his discussion found in chapter 4. He said that believers, unlike those in the world, would not be caught unready for Christ's coming. One also finds discussion of the coming of Jesus in 2 Thessalonians. In chapter 2, addressing the false teaching since he left Thessalonica that Christ had already come, he tells the Christians that they have no anxiety over this teaching. So that just gives you a lot of sense that this is the major idea being pushed. That should give some force to an argument. Contextual reasons for apostasy are then to be rapture. What is the context of 2 Thessalonians 2 that would lead one to accept that the rapture rather than defection or rebellion is in view? Let us look at the immediately preceding verses to the reference of an apostasia. 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 2 reads, "Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come." The purpose of Paul's teaching on the coming of Christ was to comfort the church. Each text in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians emphasizes this truth. If apostasy carries a sense of departure, following his words in 2:1, this would in fact add to the comfort and assurance. You catch that? All these examples are about comfort, comfort, comfort. And now you say, and when that apostasy comes, all those bad things start happening, that doesn't fit in with the comfort message. See, it doesn't flow with all the other examples. That's, something to think about. Moreover, he sought through verse 3 to assuage them of the false notion taught by those false teachers who came to them that the day of the Lord had already come. Contrary to this false teaching, the day of the Lord, a time of judgment, tells you where my view is, would not come until the two events occurred. That is, these two things have to occur before this day of the Lord begins. One is the apostasia, the other the rise of the man of sin. Since neither of these two had taken place, they should not believe that the time for God's judgment had arrived. What makes the most sense in the context? That the day of the Lord had not come because of rebellion against government or defection from the faith had not occurred, or that the departure to be with Christ had not occurred? Remember 1 Thessalonians 1, the encouragement was that the coming of Christ would rescue believers from the coming wrath. In addition to this, there are at least three more arguments that favor departure rather than a rebellion, defection in the passage. One, in passages where rebellion or defection is in view, the context speaks of the rebellion or defection. But such is not in view in preceding verses in 2 Thessalonians. Rather, as we have seen in a brief review of 1 and 2 Thessalonians, the coming of Christ is in view. Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to Him. Since the subject of the passage, then, is the coming of Christ, and nothing in this passage or any other, to my knowledge, has discussion of rebellion against government or defection from Christianity as being a prerequisite for Christ's coming, the most natural understanding of apostasy would be a spatial departure in concert with 1 Thessalonians 4. Matter of fact, in each of the chapters. Certainly Matthew 24 speaks of many being led to follow the Antichrist, but there's nothing about true believers following false Christ as an indication of Christ's coming. That's mixing up rapture and tribulation there. Moreover, the events of Matthew 24 refer to the coming of Christ in judgment, not salvation, relate to the time of the tribulation afterwards. A statement of false teachers in the church is given in Acts 20, but again, these do not, these do not concern the man of sin. Second, the word apostasy has the unusual article occurring with it, signifying a specific event is in view, the departure, and one that is known to the readers. The only event that fits with this special sense would seem to be in 2 Thessalonians 2:1 and the former teaching of Paul in 1 Thessalonians, particularly chapters 4 and 5. This would also favor rapture perspective. Last of all is the use of restrainer in verses 6 through 7. What is Paul speaking of when he mentions a restrainer that keeps the man of sin from arising? Note that the restrainer does not impact the apostasia. The term apostasia and the rise of the man of sin are probably not the same event in verse 3. And the contrast of the restrainer and the man of sin lends support to apostasia being a departure. Verses 6 and 7 seem to be a parallel of apostasia and the man of sin. Generally, the restrainer, verses 6 and 7, has been taken to a reference to the Holy Spirit of the church, though some have seen this as reference to government. What is interesting is that the idea of restrainer is expressed in both a personal and impersonal way. Text reads, and you know what restrains him now, so that in he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is at work. Only he who now restrains him will do so until he's taken out of the way. So there's a what that restrains and a who that restrains. What is it that keeps the man of sin from arising? And who keeps him from arising? I believe it is reasonable to conclude that the presence of the church restrains him, and the presence of the work of the Holy Spirit in the church restrains him. When the Antichrist comes to power, God's redeemed will no longer be present, and as the Holy Spirit came upon the church in Acts 2, he leaves it with the church in 2 Thessalonians 2. So it seems to me that both preceding and following the concept of apostasia is a contextual idea of rapture more than it is a contextual idea of rebellion and defection. So, well, what about some interaction with people who are wrong? Excuse me, I said that wrong. I'm just joking around. There are really good people that hold viewpoints other than this. And like I say, as I say in the first, the meaning of apostasy is not a crux interpretum. That is, it doesn't matter where you go with this, it's not going to affect pre-trib. On the other hand, it adds something to it if it is true. Robert Gundry, as many of you know, in his book years ago, made a big impact, a big splash, as a dispensationalist who was not holding to many dispensational views here. The claim is made that apostasy never speaks of a departure in Greek literature, specifically the New Testament. I've already dealt with this earlier in the chapter, much more depth elsewhere. The person who is probably an important critique against apostasy being the rapture is Robert Gundry. His arguments have even convinced a stalwart, or maybe I should say did even convince, a stalwart pre-tribulation such as John Walvoord. Gundry recognizes that English, an early proponent of the rapture view, did discover apostasy as meaning departure in the classical period. Gundry recognized that, but considered this discovery to be unimportant for the word in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. He says that the four sources for determining the meaning are found in the New Testament, of which you only have two instances, remember. And one's clearly the idea of defection, so what's the other? The Greek Old Testament, where you have several examples of rebellion and falling away. The Koine, and classical Greek. He's unconvinced that the word apostasia carries its meaning then in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Since the predominant meaning of apostasy is revolt and religious defection, he believes that this would govern its use in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. What I find interesting that he didn't mention the most important way to determine the meaning of a word, and that's context. That's what I was always taught in hermeneutics, that when you have a series of words, and if I had a little, in my chapter I have a little circle where I develop what is called semantic distance, where you have a central idea called unmarked meaning, where you don't have to say anything else and everybody agrees on what it means, because that's the normal way you use the word. That's unmarked meaning. Marked meaning is when you have to use descriptors to give me more information to know how I should understand that word to move one way or the other. It can't mean everything, but it means something within a circle of meaning, a semantic distance. Dictionaries don't tell you the meaning of a word. They tell you the range of meaning of a word. You need to understand that. Say, well, this lexicon proves such and such. No, it proves that this has this range of meaning. That's all it proves. Then you have to decide context for it. And it's not decided by word count. The only other instance of apostasy is Acts 21:21, when Paul is challenged as teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. The meaning is clear, religious defection. But notice the meaning is clear. We don't have to debate it. It's clear. Gundry believes that the two instances in the New Testament then, Acts 21:21 and 2 Thessalonians 2:3, would convey the idea of defection from the faith despite no such reference in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, because even without defection being in the context, the word apostasy has inherently come to mean defection. Why? They transliterated it. So automatically the case is solved. Such is not the case. Context must always be considered in deciding the meaning of words, yet in the passages that apostasy is translated revolt or defection, the context naturally leads one to the translation. This is not true in 2 Thessalonians. The context does not address these negative ideas, but the focus is the coming of Christ and what must precede the day of the Lord. Consequently, the idea of spatial departure is not outside the possible meaning. Again, I'm speaking of possible here. Based on the concept of the specific meaning of the word, I think the context is most important. But then again, that's what is usually important in determining any meaning of a word. The noun cannot mean departure, since the term is a technical term or word for religious apostasy. This is a little article that was done in which this person sought to demonstrate that for sure departure cannot be the word meaning. A man by the name of Gary Sjogren. I picked up some arguments from him. He says that Paul uses the word aphistemi for falling away in 1 Timothy 4:1 and the noun apostasia for defection. In response to the suggestion that apostasia might suggest departure rather than religious defection, he says, Can this interpretation hold up? To be sure, the cognate ephistemi has to depart as one of its meanings. One of the arguments that people use for rapture, view of 2 Thessalonians 2:3, point to those uses of the verb and claim, aha! So apostasia means departure, not apostasy. This is fallacious use of the Greek. One cannot simply import that meaning into the noun. Paul does not use the verb in 2 Thessalonians, but the noun. The noun form, apostasia, is a Jewish and Christian technical term for religious apostasy. And how do we know that? We have one example in the New Testament. Now we're talking about New Testament interpretation here. So because I have one statement in Acts 21 where you have defection from the law of faith of Moses, that's our example, automatically 2 Thessalonians 2:3 demonstrates what? It's a technical term for apostasy. I don't see how that follows. Being used to describe Judas Iscariot, the Antichrist, and the end-time religious rebellion, that is the meaning here. I want you to go see if you can find apostasia with Judas Iscariot, the Antichrist, and end-time religious rebellion. You will not find it. It doesn't exist. And so the very argument he makes doesn't hold. Now, Sjogren may be correct when he says that apostasia does not refer to the church taken away from the earth. I mean, maybe. But if he is accurate, he nonetheless wrongly states the argument. He insists that apostasia means apostasy, but this is arguing in a circle. He assumes what he seeks to prove. See, it says apostasy, so the word must mean apostasy. But if I say, well, the word means departure, now what kind, the argument doesn't follow. Context follows. See? I think he just argues in a circle. This is like taking the word baptisma must refer to sprinkling and pouring because those who use these ceremonial modes refer to them as baptism. I'm not going to get into that debate with anybody here. All I'm saying is the word baptisma became a technical term in usage in the church and eventually in transliteration in the KJV, and so people use baptism for everything. But to argue, well, it must mean such and such because I baptize somebody, I baptize them how? By sprinkling. Well, how do you immerse somebody by sprinkling? I guess you could in a really heavy shower. But nonetheless, it's playing with words, in my opinion. The English word apostasy is a transliteration of apostasia, so one has still not defined the meaning of the word. He has assumed it. In fact, the word apostasia means departure. We can debate on whether this is a departure from religious belief or some of the content of departure, but only one instance of this noun occurs in the New Testament. I should say one other. In all other instances of the word, the kind of departure, religious, political, or otherwise, is clearly evident. In other words, when you look in the Septuagint, when you look in other sources, it is clear that they're talking about what they're talking about. 2 Thessalonians is not that way if you're looking for rebellion or defection. It doesn't occur. So why does Paul throw this word that agreeably is used to mean that in certain contexts in the Old Testament here in 2 Thessalonians? It means departure. The only idea of departure in this context is the gathering of the church. Ultimately, a word has meaning only in its context. Lexicographers can talk. Lexicographer, people who are in lexicography, really describe what they find to be uses of words throughout literature. They are not infallible in this regard. I'm going to work on that after I leave. Where does he find support that apostasy is used to describe the actions of Judas Iscariot and so forth? I mean, he has to read into the text. It's not there. He goes to great length in demonstrating religious rebellions and defections in the words of 1 Enoch and Matthew 24, which, by the way, you had the word not apostasy there, but scandizo here is used for fall away and not apostasy. He then argues for that in 2 Thessalonians 2:5. Paul teaches that believers about the final apostasy. You won't find it. His strongest argument, in my perspective, is a comparison of the components of Matthew 24 with 2 Thessalonians 2. I think this is interesting. One could try to make an argument. I'm just saying if I were arguing his view, I think you could probably try to make an argument between Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2 that these are components that are similar. But anyway, I move past that. Now, Sjogren then discusses various persons in the time of the New Testament who apostatized, but I don't want to go into this with you. The fact is, when you look at all these people, they don't occur with the word apostasia. See, and that's the big issue people want to make. They don't want to say, oh, episteme, that's something different. Okay, what about apostasia? That's what the argument is. You don't find these used that way. Now, Sjogren says that to understand the restrainer in 2 Thessalonians 2, 6 through 7 as spirit of church is speculative, since no mention of the church or spirit is found in the passage. I want you to listen to this now. This is how people argue. I read this and I read it a couple times. I thought, what? He says, you look in 2 Thessalonians 6 and you will not find the word Holy Spirit. You will not find the word church. And in view of that, we should not impose that and put that into the passage. So he thinks it probably refers to an angel. Particularly Michael. You find that in that passage? I just thought, oh well, so much for that. Let's move on to the arguments of Jeremy Lyle, one of Tommy Ice's favorite friends. In view of Thomas Ice's article on the Rapture of 2 Thessalonians 2:3, Mr. Lyle takes to task Thomas Ice for wrongly understanding linguistics and lexicography and claims to have studied all the instances of apostasy in Greek literature. I don't know if he did or not, but he claims it. From which he deduces that the term in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 must mean apostasy or rebellion and cannot mean departure, particularly a physical departure. The manner in which he seeks to prove his case against Ice is to dismiss the meaning of departure being central to the word, as it comes from the Greek term ephistemi, meaning to stand away from, the literal meaning of ephistemi, epa and histemi. He quotes an article dealing with English and Japanese translation deriving the idea of core meaning of a word. I don't know if I should read all this to you. But he goes into the question that, well, as you deal with any language, he said, you have a core meaning. That is, the meaning that people would understand you to mean in a given context, in the fact of, how people use the word. I mean, when I say house, you, generally speaking, don't think of me. You probably think of a habitation in which people live. When you think of head, you think of this thing on top of the body, probably not something else. So the fact is there are core meanings, he says. Well, he's not inventing a new linguistic idea. We always understand what that is. By the way, he didn't tell me the source for this linguistic study. I don't know where he got it. He just says it's there. In reality, he said, little new here that I've not already argued in my work in this paper and in more detail in Apostasy in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, Apostasy or Rapture, which is in the book by Demian Ice. I use the term unmarked meaning here rather than core meaning, but the sense is the same. The unmarked meaning is the meaning of the word that is nearest to the usage of the word by the speakers of a language that would be understood if there is no context that leads to another sense. For example, when speaking of head, the normal unmarked meaning of this word is the physical head residing on one's shoulders, but when on a ship in the Navy, the word head takes on a totally different sense. One that is not in general parlance in the culture. I mean, it has sort of leaked over a little bit, sort of like the word sharing, but generally speaking, when people say head, they're not thinking of a restroom. Okay? If you're on a ship, you might think of that. The context would tell you which meaning of head is intended, even on a ship. And you can use the word physical head on a ship too. But the context would immediately tell you what I'm saying. Where's the head would not say, where's your head? See? Or I'm in a hurry, or something. So Lyle makes much of the fact that the usage of a word does not necessarily relate to its etymology, which language scholars are in agreement today, especially since the important work of James Barr's Semantics of Biblical Language, in which he falls to methodology, I tell you, my typing's really getting bad here, of relying on root meaning in TD&T. That's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. Barr was correct in his analysis. Lyle quotes Don Carson for support. One of the most enduring errors, the root fallacy, presupposes that every word actually has a meaning bound up with its shape or components. In this view, meaning is determined by etymology, that is, by the root or roots of a word. How many times have we been told that because of verbal cognative apostolos is apostello, the root meaning of apostle is the one who is being sent? Well, the fact is they are related somewhat, but I'd grant that the word apostolos doesn't mean necessarily that, can mean more. Lyle then continues that Carson says a word cannot have meanings without bounds. We all agree, I've already told you about the circle. But must be shaped by the context in which the word is found, in which I've been arguing this whole time. And that the etymology of a word cannot determine the meaning of a given word in a particular context. I have no difficulty with Carson or the study on English and Japanese, cited by Lyle, which he fails to document. I have difficulty not with the premise, but with his application of it to the meaning of apostasia. Some words do not move far from their root meaning. Really. There's a lot of verbs and nouns that relate to each other that almost maintain right together. Sometimes they get far apart. It all varies according to what word you're talking about. Take the word prevent in 1 Thessalonians 4:15 in the KJV. The translators correctly translated the Greek word philauto, if I can say it, as prevent, but the word has changed since 1611. Prevent is from the Latin prevenio, that which goes before. But now the word prevent means hinder, to stop. Well, I would say to go before and stop or hinder are quite different in meaning. In 1611, using the Latin, they used the English word that clearly meant to go before, and we don't think of it that way anymore. So that's quite a difference. But not everything's that way. Sometimes the meanings are very closely related. See, this is easily resolved by looking at the Greek. But what occurs when translators do not translate words like baptisma, anathema, episkopos, or apostasia? Literally translating these would produce immersed, cursed, overseer, and departure, leaving a sense of which these words are developed by context to the ones who use them in a literary piece and to the interpreters of those literary works. Instead, we see baptism, anathema, bishop, or apostasy. See, not translations, but transliterations in which people have invested a lot of theology. Worse yet, many influenced by such transliterations become overly influenced by these meanings and based on theological prejudices come up with pouring or sprinkling for baptisma, left out of sigma, with eternally condemned for anathema, bishop, that is an authority figure over various churches, for episkopos, and defection or apostasia for apostasia. Let's take a couple of examples. Paul says in Galatians 1:8 that if anyone should preach another gospel than that which he had preached to the person or even angel should be cursed. Some translations use the transliteration anathema, very popular word in the early church. By that I don't mean the first century, but the early time of the church fathers, anathema. But others are more forceful and say eternally condemned. The nearly inspired version says that. So that's a meaning not in the text. You will not find the word anathema in Galatians to mean eternally condemned. It doesn't mean it. It's within the context of Jews thinking about blessings and cursings. It's judgment questions, not the fact of you burning over askew. It's not the debate. Again, several times in the New Testament, the word baptizo and baptisma is transliterated. Had the translators used the meaning of the word as immerse, then much ecclesial debate would probably not occurred in Protestantism. Transliteration seems to muddy the waters. In the same way, if we had followed Jerome's careful translation or those early English translations by translating apostasy as departure, the debate would be much clearer today. Lyle is heavily influenced by the transliterated word apostasy so that he argues in a circle, as stated earlier, but he's also confused in his use of lexicography. It is true that apostasy is a later form of apostasis, but this proves little since both carry the idea of departure. He criticizes Ice for confusing the two in Little and Scott's classical lexicon and saying that Little and Scott do not give apostasy as meaning departure and disappearance, or in his words, they offer no secondary definition. But here's the reason why. He used the wrong lexicon. He did. Apparently, he only checked the intermediate student lexicon and not the authoritative larger lexicon, which would have helped him a lot. That's probably his problem. The latter includes more meanings and should be the one used for his study. The large Little and Scott does have the meaning that Ice references. As a matter of fact, I looked at it even recently just to be sure again. It's there. and I'm not going to give all this to you. The point I can read here, it says departure, disappearance. Anybody see that? Okay, that's in there. This is a larger lexicon. A second correction that he offers is that the word apostasis, which he says is what ICE builds its case of departure on, does not appear in the New Testament, but instead, I don't know what that is. This is true, but the word that Little and Scott define as meaning apostasy, departure, and disappearance is apostasia and not apostasis. Lyle's point is mute. If you look, he got it mixed up. He was just confusing the two. Well, third, he emphasized that apostasia does not mean departure, which I'll grant it to him, but this proves nothing. That is, there are many instances of it where it does not necessarily mean a departure in the sense of some physical spatial departure. It could be translated, I suppose, defection. The usage is whether it means it in one of the two instances in the New Testament. That's what we're dealing with. Fourth, he insists that apostasia does not refer to physical departure, and early examples are later examples of the work. Something is simply not true. Surely, at least in the patristic period, and I was looking at Lamps right before I left home, just to check this one more time. And Lamp, the major patristic Greek lexicon, clearly has this word meaning departure. That's how it was understood, and maybe one of the reasons why even Jerome did as he did. Fifth, since departure is listed second in the lexicon, apparently he found the reference since his first objection. By the way, I found this interesting, Tommy. He mentions it refers in the second reference. Well, if it wasn't in there in the larger, and he just came across it apparently and didn't go back and correct his other. I don't know why he says this. It does not mean this in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, and the predominant meaning apostasy or defection. I prefer departure from the faith. How does this follow? Must a meaning in a given context always follow the first listed? Did you catch this? He said, well, even if it is in there, it's the second one mentioned. And I'm thinking, okay, so if it's the second one mentioned, it can't be the right meaning. So if that's true, the second, third, and fourth meanings, this range of meaning, we just need to take all those out and use the first one. That's why you have second, third, and fourth mentions, because these are ranges of meaning. They are not the meaning. So his point is really meaningless. You like that? All righty. One wishes that scholars would even follow the first meaning in the example of Iro in John 15. That's just my jab. I found it interesting on John 15. People like this make such a big argument about the uses of words. I don't know how many lexica in my office of various periods of Greek history. I mean, I've got them all over the place of different periods and different kinds. I looked up Iro in every single one of them, and the first meaning in every one was lift up. But nobody ever translates it that way, and they come up with meanings that no lexica ever even mentions, called cut off. You won't even find a single lexicon that says cut off, lop off, chop off, and yet you'll find translations use that where they won't use the first meaning that every lexicon gives. I don't know why that is. Anyway, 6, the example, by the way, found in Euripides that he mentions in his argument against you, apostasin biou, means end of life, that is death. Though this citation seems to be the basis for his departure definition, this is him quoting, we do not believe this type of departure Dr. Ice has in mind. Actually, this fits quite nicely. I would suggest that one's departure from life, genitive of separation, is a departure of the spirit from the physical body. Would you think so? This is not the resurrection perspective of the rapture, but it is a true departure. Conclusion. In this short presentation of an hour, almost, I've attempted to present evidence that the departure of the church from the earth very well may be discussed in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, as well as respond to detractors. This meaning agrees with examples in the Greek world, is consistent with the context of 2 Thessalonians 2, and the emphasis of the Apostle Paul in the Thessalonian epistles to provide comfort to these early believers. This interpretation of 2 Thessalonians 2:3 may also provide hope for us today. Okay.
Thank you, Wayne. That is a great addition to your original article and When the Trumpet Sounds from the mid-90s.
Yeah.
and some good interaction there. I think it's a much clearer presentation, than I remember from previously, because you were going through the minutiae of the usage of apostasia in classical literature.
Giving all 220 examples.
Yes, you did. Any questions or comments? Okay. And so that means that if that's a physical departure, then that is a very strong verse for pre-tribulationalism.
On this CD we have that got some pages missing. Is this updated from what you did here?
My CV?
We got some pages missing from...
Oh, yes. These were added afterwards. This is the real stuff. You have to pay for this.
No, all papers in their
we will
final
make it available.
form will be put up on our Pre-Trib website.
As soon as I do my word check.
Yeah. And
without going into anything in particular, some things have been going on in my life recently that have just really put me under such pressure. I was working like crazy to get this done. And
you got it.
Well, we got it done.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. House. I really appreciated that presentation. I was wondering if you had a chance to read the revised version of the 3 Views on the Rapture published in 2011. Dr. Blazing, progressive dispensationalist, took the pre-trib view. By the way, I was encouraged in that I thought that the progressive dispensational view would probably leave a departure from pre-trib, but he stands for it very strongly.
Well, I'm glad to hear that about Craig. Craig's a very fine scholar. I respect these people. Some of you heard my presentation a few years back, The Confessions of a Pre-Progressive Dispensationalist, that I did, and I believed in that it offers, progressive dispensationalism offers the potential, I think, to move away, but I don't think requires you to, and I'm glad to see that Craig didn't.
In his defense of the pre-trib view, he rejects this view of apostasia.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I was wondering if we do reject this, if somebody takes his view or another view, what do you think would be the second best defense of a pre-trib view for this passage?
Hold it, just one other statement. The best defense for pre-tribulational view from this passage?
Yes, second,
okay.
Thank you. 3.
Well, first of all, I would say that if I did not believe this is in fact reference to a departure like the coming of Christ, gathering of Christians, that in arguing a pre-tribulational view, I don't really think apostasia adds anything to an argument, because there's nothing here about a rebellion or defection in the passage, so really you're left with nothing to say, other than just saying, well, the passage teaches a rebellion. Well, it teaches it only in that word, then. It doesn't teach it in the context. But if you argue it the way I've been arguing it, then it actually confirms the context. So I think, if you don't take the view, I wouldn't even make an argument on apostasia here, because there's nothing to argue other than what I inject into the passage.
Yeah, but this is always presented by Gundry and others as a problem passage for us, and many laymen see it as a problem passage for us. I think it's because they take the word apostasia, to refer to departure from the faith. But Gordon Lewis, I think, in the 60s has, 67 has probably the best, in Bibliotheosacra, has probably the best presentation of the contextual rationale for taking apostasia to refer to physical departure.
Yeah, I mean, if in fact you did, like, just to say it one more time, if this does not mean departure in the sense of what we're thinking of rapture, if I were arguing this passage as a pre-trib, I just wouldn't make an issue of it, because there's nothing to say.
Yeah. Also, it's interesting in E. Schuyler English's original dealing of this. I can't remember when it was, in the 30s or 40s or something. No, it's probably in the 50s.
I think it was earlier, but anyway. Whatever.
Okay. he sent off to 8 scholars, and it's interesting, the four, and they were split 50-50. The four that supported his view were people who studied it in depth. Dwight Pentecost was one of those people. The four that didn't study it in depth, were not convinced. And they mention in their responses about how I just got back from a trip and I wasn't able to, study it in depth, but my inclinations are blah, blah, blah.
Didn't have my Greek lexicon with me or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a significance in verse 2 where it says, you were mentioning it was saying day of the Lord, but those who have the King James, it says day of Christ. Is there a significance there if it's day of Christ as opposed to day of the Lord?
Let me look here a second.
It's in the second verse there.
Yeah, I just want to check out the Greek here. People have made differences in that. The Nestle Aland text here has the Lord, and
right.
So I suppose some people do make a big difference between day of Christ, day of the Lord. I don't know if I want to get into that argument. I think the day of the Lord in the Old Testament, as it's carried over into the New Testament, is talking about the day of God's judgment. Day of the Lord repeatedly is God visiting the people, essentially in judgment throughout the Old Testament. So, but whether this is
because somebody has spoken to me who doesn't believe in pre-trib, obviously, says that if it's the day of Christ, that's speaking of the rapture, then these things have to take place before the rapture.
Oh, I see.
That's where they would be coming from. And that's why I always said day of the Lord, and then I'm looking at my own Bible and it says day of Christ, and I'm kind of going, well.
Yeah, well, see, if you take this, if you take the day of the Lord here being the time of judgment, then the issue of the rapture is a preceding event.
Right.
And obviously if you take day of Christ here, then you say, well, that's maybe the rapture itself. But the fact is the better Greek manuscripts seem to have Lord, so I think that settles that question.
Okay.
Christ is the more difficult reading.
I don't want to get into textual criticism here with you.
This is the Texas Receptus. That says Christ.
Yes.
So that's why.
All right, I appreciate your presentation as well. I actually agree with you. I think this does talk about departure.
Where are you?
I'm right here.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry.
Okay.
I think this does talk about the departure as well. And along that line, it's something that I thought about while you're presenting. There seems to be a measurable event that he's talking about. And if it's just the rebellion, that's a hard event to measure, unless, of course, they're just talking about the man of lawlessness being revealed, being the measurable event. Didn't know if you wanted to talk about that aspect of it, because if it's rebellion, how do you measure that?
Yeah, you're right on that. The fact is, if you're talking about rebellion, at what point of the rebellion is, it could be a lot of things, and you wouldn't necessarily know is this the rebellion, is that the rebellion, is this, is this the defection of that? When the rapture occurs, you won't have to debate that one. So that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Dr. Lewis argues that section there in verses 2, 3, and 4, I think it is, perform a A-B-B-A chiasm. And he further supports that the departure is the return of Christ because of the symmetry of the text in that chiastic structure.
What is the A? What's the B?
I can't remember now.
Okay, we'll
I
have to
just
take a look at it.
remember
I'm not familiar with
an
it.
argument from the structural thing, and that it would be supported in the A prime statement, the coming of Christ or something like that.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I know. I just thought I'd throw that out for people who want to investigate that.
That's next year's paper.
That factor, yes. That's part of the blah, blah,
Anyone
blah.
else?
I'm just curious.
Anyone else?
We're going to have a vote here. How many people would hold the physical departure view of this at this time? Raise your hand. I'm just curious. Okay. How many of y'all are undecided? In other words, you can't really decide, or you're in between? Okay. There's a few of you. How many of y'all would take the departure from the faith view? Okay. Well, that's a real sea change over the years, because when Tim LaHaye first wrote to me, I was like everybody else. I just rejected it out of hand because, you go the Septuagint and all this kind of stuff.
Since I'm Augustinian in most of my thinking, I'll probably take Augustine's view, the apostate. Yeah.
Well, but the more you look at it, I've read 2 or 3 theses and all this kind of stuff on it, and it's very interesting, and it's like the attitude I've sensed over the years is like, if we as pre-tribs bring this in later on, we'll be accused of cheating or something by the post-tribbers, and so we just leave the arguments where they're at or something like that.
Something that would be helpful that I just haven't had time to do would be to study this as a focus in which you use a number of other verbs of similar fashion and see how they develop from verbs to nouns in relationships, because a lot of people say it's irrelevant that the verb almost consistently has that idea because a noun doesn't. And I'm saying, I'm not sure if that's true in Greek, because I've seen verbs that clearly carry on into their nouns. And
but even if that's generally true,
it doesn't.
Then
it's just
may
a
not be
supportive issue.
There would probably be exceptions.
Yeah, but it's just a supportive question.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Chuck Smith, over 30 years ago, held that view. I know he has a doctorate.
He still does. He mentioned it when he was here a couple of years ago.
But I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, and I know a lot of us here would like to thank all of you scholars and men who write books that bless the body of Christ. There's a lot of us here who are not really book writers. We're just interested in your books and your work, and we want to just say we thank you.